Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.
Of all the roles she had ever inhabited in her life, the two she cherished most were those of a devoted wife and a steadfast best friend. The walls of her home, warm and familiar, bore witness to countless evenings filled with laughter, shared meals, and moments of quiet intimacy between her and her husband. Their marriage had never been perfect, but in its best moments, it felt like a shelter from the unpredictability of the world. In this space, she found solace and a sense of purpose, believing they were building something lasting and good together. Her best friend had always been a part of this world, her presence like a second heartbeat in the rhythm of daily life. They had met long before she ever imagined herself married. During those youthful years when every secret and every dream was exchanged in whispered conversations late into the night, the friendship endured the tests of time, outlasting other relationships and even surviving the initial awkwardness when her friend first met her future husband. In the early days of her marriage, she often marveled at how seamlessly her friend fit into their new routine. Weekends spent together, group outings, inside jokes that crossed the boundaries between friendship and family. The lines between the roles sometimes blurred, but she saw this as a testament to the strength of her bonds. She felt fortunate, believing that the presence of her best friend only enriched her relationship with her husband. She would confide in her friend about small irritations, the little misunderstandings that inevitably arose between two people sharing a life. Her friend always listened without judgment, offering advice with a mixture of candor and affection. These exchanges became a ritual, a way of processing daily life, and she rarely considered the possibility that her confidences could be anything but harmless. As the seasons changed, so too did the subtle dynamics of these intertwined relationships. Her husband, once enthusiastic about group dinners and shared vacations, began to retreat into quieter routines. He still participated, but his laughter was less frequent, his silences more pronounced. She noticed, but explained it away as the natural ebb and flow of marriage. Work pressures, fatigue, or simply the changing tides of intimacy. She rationalized the shifts and held on to the belief that, with time, the old comfort would return. When she raised her concerns with her friend, she found reassurance in gentle words and familiar encouragements. Her friend would remind her of the strength she had shown through previous hardships, or suggest that all couples experience rough patches. In these conversations, her husband's worries sometimes appeared trivial, almost abstract, diluted by the closeness and loyalty of her confidant. The patterns persisted. She made efforts to bridge the widening gaps at home, organizing date nights, proposing new shared hobbies, seeking out moments of connection. Yet the unease lingered, a low current beneath the surface. Whenever a disagreement arose, no matter how small, she instinctively reached for her phone, eager to recount the details to her friend. These conversations, meant to comfort and clarify, slowly took on a new tone. Her friend's responses grew more forthright, the advice less neutral and more pointed. She didn't notice the shift at first, grateful as always for the certainty and clarity her friend provided. If her husband forgot an anniversary or seemed distracted at dinner, her friend would raise an eyebrow or offer a sharp observation. Still, she clung to the belief that honesty was the foundation of true friendship, and welcomed the feedback without reservation. The passing months brought new joys and new stresses. A minor illness in the family, a promotion at work, the slow but steady accumulation of everyday responsibilities. Through it all, her friend remained a constant presence. They celebrated victories together, offered shoulders to cry on during disappointments, and marked milestones both big and small. Her husband was part of these celebrations, but increasingly on the periphery, a detail in the landscape rather than the focal point. She sensed his withdrawal more acutely. But instead of confronting him directly, she continued to lean on her friend for guidance and perspective. She trusted her friend's intentions completely, convinced that the advice she received was born out of love and a desire for her happiness. Looking back, she could trace the outlines of where things began to fray. The nights when her husband lingered in his study long after dinner. The growing sense of formality that crept into their conversations. The feeling that their home was no longer a sanctuary but a stage for performances neither of them truly believed in. Her friend, ever perceptive, noticed these changes too, and her comments grew more frequent, more insistent. She questioned whether the marriage was bringing her joy, whether her husband truly appreciated all that she gave. In moments of doubt, these questions echoed in her mind, eroding her confidence and subtly reshaping her perceptions. Despite the shifting sands beneath her feet, she held on to the memories of when things felt simple and clear. She remembered the laughter around the kitchen table, the shared glances of understanding, the way her friend and husband could both make her feel whole in different ways. The trust she placed in both relationships seemed unshakable, a foundation that would weather any storm. Even as doubts crept in, she believed that open communication and unwavering loyalty would see them through. What she could not have known was how easily the boundaries she valued could dissolve. How swiftly words exchanged in confidence could become weapons. And how the people she loved most could, in their own ways, become strangers in the very home they once filled with warmth. The subtle cracks began as barely noticeable, like hairline fractures beneath the glossy surface of her daily life. She went about her routines with practiced ease, preparing breakfast in the gentle hush of morning and watching her husband gather his things for the day, his gestures mechanical, his smile a brief flicker. She would ask him about his plans, about his thoughts, and often he would answer with vague reassurances or distracted nods. At first, she convinced herself that nothing was truly amiss, that the monotony of adult life sometimes dulled even the happiest relationships. Yet beneath this rationalization, something unsettled began to take root. Her best friend's presence remained as steadfast as ever, filling the empty spaces left by her husband's growing silence. They messaged throughout the day, exchanged stories and complaints, and continued the rituals that had long defined their friendship. More and more, her friend's opinions shaped her understanding of her marriage. When she mentioned her husband's irritability or forgetfulness, her friend responded with unfiltered honesty, sometimes suggesting that he was insensitive, or worse, ungrateful for all she did. These judgments, once delivered gently, became edged with a subtle sharpness. She found comfort in her friend's candor, telling herself it was refreshing to hear the truth rather than empty reassurances. But this truth often carried a bitterness she struggled to ignore. The advice she received, initially compassionate, grew bolder. Her friend remarked on small details, questioning why her husband rarely joined their outings, why he seemed closed off or disengaged. Each time she brought her concerns to her friend, she was met with more questions, more doubts. Was she sure he appreciated her? Did he ever truly listen? Was she happy, or simply comfortable? The questions lodged in her mind, replaying in quiet moments, eroding the confidence she once had in the quiet routines of her home life. Meanwhile, her husband felt the shifting tide. Though he rarely gave voice to his discomfort, he began declining invitations to gatherings where her friend would be present. He arrived home later, excused himself more often to his study, and when she pressed him to share what was wrong, he hesitated, then brushed it off as work stress or fatigue. The warmth between them dimmed by imperceptible degrees, replaced by a politeness that felt brittle, like glass waiting to shatter. She noticed how rarely he laughed, how his words grew shorter, and how the easy intimacy they once enjoyed slipped quietly away. Still, she returned to her friend, seeking analysis and advice. Each time, her friend dissected the situation with precision, often focusing on her husband's shortcomings rather than offering balanced insight. One evening, a minor disagreement over household chores spiraled into an argument that left the air heavy with resentment. She recounted every detail to her friend, who responded with a mixture of sympathy and indignation, insisting that she deserved better, that no woman should be taken for granted. Her friend's words, delivered with unwavering certainty, offered a kind of validation she found increasingly addictive. In the days that followed, she began to see her husband's actions through her friend's eyes, interpreting minor irritations as signs of deep-seated flaws. Each instance of forgetfulness became an act of carelessness. Each silence became a sign of disregard. The cycle intensified, her trust in her husband eroding as her friend's voice grew louder in her mind. Her friend's presence in their lives, once a source of joy, now cast a long shadow. Her husband withdrew further, resenting what he perceived as an alliance against him. He watched as private matters became topics of conversation between the two women. And while he tried to protest, his objections sounded petty in comparison to their shared confidence. He felt cornered, outnumbered in his own home, and responded by closing himself off, turning inward to nurse wounds he could not articulate. She noticed his growing distance but told herself that he was unwilling to face the truth, that he refused to change or even listen. She believed, more than ever, in the righteousness of her friend's perspective. As weeks passed, she began to rely on her friend for emotional support, sharing every new frustration or disappointment, however minor. Their conversations grew longer, more intense, the boundaries between her marriage and her friendship blurring until they were almost indistinguishable. Her friend's criticisms of her husband became routine, woven into the fabric of daily life, and soon she found herself echoing those criticisms at home. Her husband, in turn, grew more defensive, meeting her complaints with silence or, on rare occasions, quiet anger. The warmth that once defined their relationship was replaced by a wary truce, each of them retreating to separate corners of the home, each nursing grievances that could not be voiced without sparking another argument. The friend, meanwhile, seemed to revel in her expanded role, offering ever more prescriptive advice, urging her to stand up for herself, to demand more, to refuse to settle. What began as empathy evolved into a kind of subtle antagonism, as if her friend's loyalty was predicated on highlighting everything wrong in her marriage. She clung to this support, unwilling or unable to question whether it was truly in her best interest. It became easier to accept her friend's narrative than to face the painful, complicated reality of her own relationship. As the days grew longer and the distance in her marriage widened, she retreated further into the safety of her friendship, never realizing that, in doing so, she was quietly dismantling the fragile trust that had once bound her life together. The evening that changed everything began like so many before it, with the sound of rain tapping softly against the windows and the faint hum of life in the background. She had invited her best friend over for dinner, hoping perhaps that the warmth of shared food and conversation might ease the growing tension that had settled in her home like an unwelcome guest. Her husband, though weary from a long day, had agreed to join them, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to imagine that this night might mark the start of a new chapter, a soft reset for their fraying bond. The table was set, candles flickered, and laughter came easily at first, flowing around stories of work, old memories, and gentle teasing. Yet beneath the pleasant surface, an undercurrent of unease pulsed, quiet but insistent, threatening to break through the fragile peace they'd managed to construct. As dinner progressed, Small barbs and pointed remarks began to slip into the conversation. Her friend, emboldened by a glass of wine and by months of private confidences, brought up stories of the past, highlighting moments when her husband had disappointed or hurt her, sometimes in ways he himself had not realized. What started as light-hearted anecdotes soon shifted in tone, becoming sharper, edged with judgment and a hint of accusation. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, unsure whether to laugh it off or intervene, torn between her loyalty to her friend and her desire to defend her husband. The room seemed to shrink around her, the air thick with a tension she could not dispel. Her husband, normally so composed, grew visibly uncomfortable. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his napkin. His answers shortened. The effort to maintain civility became a burden, and his occasional attempts to redirect the conversation fell flat. She noticed the way he looked at her, a silent plea for support that she hesitated to answer. Instead, she found herself frozen, unwilling to risk offending her friend by contradicting her, and unwilling to confront her husband directly. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the clatter of cutlery and the distant sound of rain. Her friend, sensing an opening, pressed further, her criticisms growing less subtle. She questioned his work schedule, his household contributions, his attitude toward their relationship. Each question landed like a small blow, eroding the remaining goodwill at the table. For a moment, she felt herself outside her own body, watching the scene unfold as if from a distance. The home she had built, the relationships she had nurtured, all of it seemed suddenly fragile, held together only by habit and a shared history that now felt irrelevant. Her friend's voice filled the room, confident and certain, while her husband's voice faded to a low murmur. When he finally spoke up, his words were laced with hurt and frustration. But even then, she remained silent, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She wondered if her friend was right, if her husband's flaws had been obvious all along and she had simply refused to see them. She questioned her own judgment, her own role in creating this moment. The confrontation escalated as the evening wore on. What began as a dinner among friends became a tribunal, her husband cast as the defendant, her friend as both prosecutor and judge. She, the one who might have been his advocate, remained mute, paralyzed by uncertainty. The accusations came faster now. He was inattentive, ungrateful, unwilling to change. Each charge was met with defensiveness, then resignation. The sense of intimacy that once defined their relationship evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical dissection of everything that had gone wrong. Her friend's words carried a conviction that brooked no disagreement, and the more her husband tried to explain, the more futile it seemed. His frustration gave way to a pained silence, and she felt a hollow ache bloom in her chest. When the meal ended, her husband rose from the table, pausing only to look at her, his expression a mixture of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. Without a word, he gathered his coat and left the apartment, the sound of the door closing echoing through the now quiet space. She sat in stunned silence, her friend beside her, a hand placed on her arm in a gesture that felt more possessive than comforting. Her mind reeled, replaying every word, every look, every choice she had made to stay silent. The reality of what had happened pressed in on her. She had allowed her marriage to become a spectacle, had failed to draw boundaries between her confidences and her commitments, and now she was left with the ruins of both. Her friend offered reassurance, promising to be there for her in the days ahead, but even that comfort felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that the damage was irreversible. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She moved through the motions of tidying up, stacking plates, wiping down surfaces, all the while haunted by the memory of her husband's retreating figure. Her friend stayed late, talking, analyzing, filling the air with explanations and justifications. She listened, nodding when required, but her thoughts drifted. She could not escape the feeling that something vital had been lost, that she had crossed an invisible line from which there would be no easy return. The apartment, once a place of laughter and warmth, now felt cold and unfamiliar, a stark reminder of what had been undone in the space of a single evening. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she heard her friend's voice, saw her husband's face, and felt the weight of her own silence pressing down on her like a stone. The following days unfolded with a heavy monotony that made each hour feel longer than the last. The apartment, once filled with the subtle background noise of two lives woven together, now felt cavernous and echoing, haunted by an absence that seeped into every corner. She moved through her daily routines in a kind of daze, clinging to rituals out of habit rather than hope. When she made coffee in the morning, she still set out 2 cups, only to put one away untouched. She wandered through rooms and found herself listening for sounds that no longer came. The shuffle of slippers, the quiet hum of a voice in another room, the unmistakable warmth of someone else's presence. The silence was sharp, almost accusatory, reminding her with every heartbeat of what had been lost. She tried reaching out to her husband, leaving messages that were never returned, drafting apologies and explanations that grew longer and more desperate with each attempt. Each day, she watched her phone in anticipation, waiting for some sign, some signal that reconciliation was possible. But as the hours stretched into days, the hope that he might respond began to dim, replaced by a persistent ache that settled into her bones. She thought about their years together, sifting through memories with a mixture of nostalgia and regret. The laughter that once rang through their home now echoed only in her mind, and she wondered at what point it had all begun to unravel. Her best friend, who had so confidently stood by her side in the wake of that disastrous dinner, seemed at first to be a lifeline. The first few days, her friend checked in constantly, calling, texting, insisting that she come over or meet for coffee. In these moments, she clung to her friend's presence, finding in her words a kind of numb reassurance. Her friend analyzed every aspect of what had happened, dissecting her husband's actions, reaffirming her right to stand up for herself, and promising that she was better off without him. It was a flood of support and validation, but something about it left her feeling hollow, as if the comfort offered was built on shaky ground. She began to sense an undercurrent of self-congratulation in her friend's words, as if her friend relished being right, being the one who had seen things most clearly. As the days turned to weeks, her friend's attention began to wane. Invitations to meet became less frequent, and conversations grew shorter, more distracted. When she called, her friend sometimes didn't answer, responding with brief texts hours later. When they did meet, her friend seemed restless, quick to change the subject, more interested in her own life than in the aftermath of the confrontation that had upended everything. She realized with a jolt that the roles had shifted. She was no longer the center of concern. Her pain had become tedious, a chapter her friend was eager to close and move on from. The loss was sudden and sharp, a new layer of abandonment that deepened the emptiness she felt inside. Left alone, she began to revisit the events of that night from every angle, searching for a moment she could change, a word she could have spoken, a boundary she should have drawn. The scenes replayed in her mind with relentless clarity, the pointed criticisms, her husband's wounded silence, her own inability to intervene or defend. She was forced to reckon with her own part in what had happened. The ways she had chosen comfort over confrontation, validation over vulnerability. The realization stung, yet it was a truth she could no longer ignore. She had let her friendship become a shield, allowing her friends' opinions to fill the space where honest conversation with her husband should have been. The isolation grew, not just physically but emotionally. She felt untethered, unable to reach either the man she had loved or the friend who had once seemed like a sister. She tried to fill her time with work, with chores, with long walks that carried her through city streets and quiet parks. Yet no distraction was sufficient. Even in crowds, she felt alone, her thoughts spiraling endlessly. She envied the couples she saw holding hands, the friends laughing together on cafe terraces. It was as if she had been exiled from the ordinary happiness that now appeared so fragile and rare. Nights were the worst. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, searching for clues she might have missed. She questioned every decision, every confidence shared, every moment of silence. Guilt became a constant companion, sometimes dull and throbbing, sometimes sharp enough to bring tears. She wondered if her husband had felt this lonely in the final months. If he had reached out for her and found only her friend's voice instead. She wanted to believe that things could be repaired, that there was a path back. But the distance seemed insurmountable. The more she dwelled on the past, the more impossible the future became. The gradual withdrawal of her friend left her feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way she had not anticipated. She realized, with growing dread, that she had no one left to turn to. The support network she had believed unbreakable had dissolved, revealing how dependent she had become on outside validation. Without her friend to interpret her emotions or her husband to share her burdens, she was forced to sit with herself, to confront the pain and regret she had spent so long avoiding. It was an uncomfortable reckoning, but also a necessary one. In this solitude, she began to ask different questions about what she truly wanted, about the patterns she had repeated, about the person she had become. The journey inward was slow, marked by tears and restless nights, but it was also the first real movement toward understanding. She could not undo the past or reclaim what had been lost, but she could choose, each day, to face herself honestly. As the days continued to pass, she discovered that survival meant more than just enduring loneliness. It meant learning to sit with her own pain, to accept responsibility, and to search for forgiveness, first from herself, and maybe, one day, from those she had hurt. As the days stretched into weeks, she found herself caught in a strange limbo, neither moving forward nor able to return to what had once been. The world continued outside her windows, unbothered by the private storms that raged within her. Each morning she woke with the hope that perhaps something would shift, that a message might appear on her phone or her friend might call to suggest coffee, that her husband might reach out with an olive branch, some small sign that she was not as completely alone as she felt. But the silence remained, stubborn and oppressive, settling around her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She busied herself with work and small projects, determined to keep the loneliness at bay. She rearranged the furniture in her living room, painted a wall she had always meant to change, and reorganized her closet. These acts of control brought fleeting satisfaction but could not erase the gnawing emptiness that lingered beneath. She caught herself imagining conversations that would never happen, crafting apologies and explanations that grew more elaborate with each repetition, yet remained unsaid. One afternoon, after a morning spent pacing the apartment, she decided to reach out again to her friend. The conversation that followed was brief and stilted. Her friend's responses were clipped, her tone impatient. She mentioned being busy, new commitments, and a need for space. The words stung, but more than that, the finality in her friend's voice left her cold. There was no warmth, no trace of the easy camaraderie that had once been their lifeline. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the door to that friendship had been closed, not with anger or dramatic confrontation, But with the slow, quiet withdrawal of attention, she hung up feeling as if she had lost not just her friend but also a piece of her own identity. The part of herself that had been defined through shared laughter, late-night confessions, and the unspoken understanding that they would always be there for each other. Desperate for connection, she tried reaching out to her husband as well. She composed long messages, filled with apologies, with admissions of fault and pleas for understanding. Each time she pressed send, her heart hammered with anxious hope, but the only response was silence. When she passed by places where they had shared memories, the cafe where they used to sit on Sunday mornings, the park where they walked in early autumn, she was overwhelmed by a sense of loss so profound it took her breath away. She wondered if he too revisited those places, or if he had managed to build a new life that had no room for old ghosts. She replayed the last months over and over, searching for a turning point, a single moment when she might have chosen differently, when she might have spoken up instead of staying silent or offered comfort instead of seeking validation. The realization dawned on her, slowly and painfully, that she had relied too heavily on her friend to interpret and mediate her emotions. Instead of turning to her husband and working through the confusion and vulnerability of marriage, she had chosen the easier route, sharing her frustrations with someone who would always take her side, who would bolster her sense of righteousness, even as it deepened the gulf between herself and her husband. In protecting herself from discomfort, she had built walls so high that neither of the people she loved most could reach her. Now, in the echo of their absence, she faced the consequences of those choices. The initial anger at her husband for leaving, at her friend for withdrawing, faded, replaced by a more complicated and honest reckoning with herself. She spent long evenings reflecting on her patterns, her need for reassurance, her fear of confrontation, her tendency to avoid conflict at any cost. She saw how, in trying to keep the peace, she had sacrificed honesty and allowed resentment to fester in silence. The arguments she had replayed in her head became less about what was said and more about what was left unsaid. The apologies never given, the confessions never made, the vulnerability never risked. She wondered whether her husband had felt as alone as she did now. Whether he too had sought solace in imagined conversations, in dreams of understanding that never quite materialized. The symmetry of their loneliness was bitterly ironic, each of them retreating further from the other in search of safety, only to find themselves marooned in solitude. As spring crept in, she noticed small changes within herself. The pain was still there, but it no longer dominated her every waking thought. She found herself enjoying quiet moments, a cup of tea on the balcony, the sound of rain at night, the softness of her favorite blanket. She began to journal, pouring her regrets and hopes onto the page. The act was private and freeing, a way to process emotions she could not share with anyone else. In those pages, she began to forgive herself, at least a little, for the choices she had made. She acknowledged her mistakes without self-pity, accepting that she could not rewrite the past, only learn from it. The impulse to seek out her friend or husband waned, replaced by a tentative curiosity about the future. She wondered what kind of life she might build on her own. One shaped not by the expectations or judgments of others, but by her own values and desires. It was an uncertain prospect, and fear still lingered at the edges. But it was also the first time in months that she felt a flicker of hope. She let herself imagine new possibilities, small acts of courage and kindness that could anchor her as she moved forward. The emptiness that had once seemed unbearable now felt like a blank canvas. Daunting, yes, but also full of promise. She began to believe that, with time, she could create something meaningful from the fragments of what had been lost. The first thing she noticed as the months passed was the slow, almost imperceptible shift in the way she inhabited her own life. The routines that once felt empty and repetitive began to take on new meaning. Each small action grounding her in the present rather than chaining her to the past she woke earlier. Allowing herself long, quiet mornings filled with gentle sunlight and the comfort of solitude. Her apartment, once a place of echoes and regrets, slowly transformed into a sanctuary of her own making. She arranged flowers on the table, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and played music just for herself. Choosing melodies that soothed rather than reminded her of what she had lost. There was a kind of grace in these simple rituals, a sense that she was building a new foundation from the ashes of her former life. She continued to write in her journal, filling page after page with confessions, questions, and dreams. Through this daily practice, she confronted the truths she had tried so long to avoid. The ways she had abandoned her own voice, the comfort she sought in others, the boundaries she had failed to draw until it was too late. The act of naming these things, of seeing them in her own handwriting, was sometimes painful but ultimately healing. She learned to forgive herself in small increments, accepting that the path to self-understanding was neither linear nor easy. On days when the sadness returned, as it inevitably did, she allowed herself to feel it without judgment, knowing that grief was not a sign of weakness but a mark of how deeply she had cared. With time, the world beyond her apartment began to open up again. She started taking long walks through the city, rediscovering streets and parks she had ignored for years. She watched the changing seasons in the shape of new leaves and the migration of birds, finding comfort in the quiet persistence of nature. Sometimes she stopped for coffee at a small cafe, bringing a book or simply watching people as they went about their days. These excursions, which once might have felt daunting or lonely, now became a source of pleasure and renewal. She relished the anonymity of being just another person in a crowd, the freedom of moving through the world without the weight of expectation or scrutiny. The loneliness that had once seemed so suffocating became something softer and more bearable. She realized that being alone did not mean being incomplete. She formed tentative connections with new people. A neighbor who offered a shy smile in the hallway, a colleague who invited her to lunch, a stranger she met at a community class. These interactions were modest, sometimes fleeting, but they reminded her that she was still capable of forming bonds, of being seen and valued outside the framework of her lost relationships. She did not rush to fill the spaces left by her husband and her friend. Instead, she learned to sit with the emptiness, to let it be a quiet witness to her growth rather than a void to be urgently filled. She reflected often on the choices that had led her here, revisiting the moments when she might have acted differently, spoken up sooner, or listened more deeply. She no longer saw these reflections as punishments, but as opportunities to understand herself and to set intentions for the future. She promised herself to honor her own needs, to trust her instincts, and to cultivate the kind of honesty in relationships that she had once feared. The ache of regret remained, but it no longer controlled her. It existed alongside the new tenderness she felt for herself, a reminder of the complexity and resilience of the human heart. As she moved through this new chapter, she found moments of joy in unexpected places. A shared laugh with a coworker, the satisfaction of completing a project, the peace of a quiet evening spent reading. She celebrated small victories, allowing herself to feel pride without shame or apology. In time, she realized that she was not defined by what she had lost, but by the way she had chosen to heal, to learn, and to begin again. Her story was not one of failure, but of transformation, a gradual and imperfect unfolding into a life that was authentically her own. She knew that memories of her husband and her friend would linger, that anniversaries and familiar places would bring both pain and nostalgia, But she also knew that the future held its own possibilities. New friendships, new adventures, perhaps even new love, if she was brave enough to welcome it. She looked forward with cautious hope, no longer haunted by the ghosts of her past but guided by the lessons they had given her. Each day, she stepped into her life with a little more confidence, a little more trust in herself, and a quiet conviction that, whatever came next, she was ready to meet it on her own terms.
Hey friends, I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.